Shabbat Shalom to everyone. I'm not playing a game here, but I had a nice message that I was going to share with you this evening. It was rooted in something that I wanted to share on the high holidays, but I ran out of sermons to give. I mean, just ask Jane how crazy I am. I usually, as I prepare for the high holidays, write 6 sermons. And then I have an argument, what are the best ones to give? And so that's part of the dilemma so there was a really good one. I altered it to share with you because it's relevant to this week's Torah portion, but I can talk about it next week because it'll be relevant next week. I wanted to share something with you about someone who passed away who's really, really close to this synagogue in a very important way. Rabbi Howard Berman, alav shalom, died on October 23rd. And he was one of the visionary leaders of the Reform movement, and he was the great advocate for classical Reform Judaism. And he, let me just give you a little bit of his biography, then I want to just share something with you that's relevant. He had a career that went for 50 years. He, as a graduate from the Hebrew Union College, in 1974, he was one of their youngest graduates. He graduated at 24. The guy was, his first position was an assistant at Temple Emmanuel in New York, where he served in the mid-70s. It led him to Chicago Sinai Congregation, from which our prayer book emerged. And so he was in the middle of this. And throughout his career, he advocated for this classical Reform Jewish approach to our religious tradition. Let me just read to you just 2 things from his obituary. It says, throughout his career, Rabbi Berman remained a resolute advocate for interfaith dialogue and a full pastoral support of interfaith families, recognizing these as central to the evolving landscape of Jewish life. And despite considerable resistance, he passionately embraced these efforts from the beginning of his career. His pioneering view of interfaith marriage as a sacred Jewish value, central to the community's inclusive growth, exemplified his deep understanding of prophetic Judaism. Interestingly, he was one of the early advocates in Judaism for LGBTQ rights. And in 1997, he co-founded the Religious Coalition for the Freedom to Marry, and he played a pivotal role in that. And his work with that organization contributed to Massachusetts becoming the first state in the United States to legalize same-sex marriage. And Rabbi Berman was personally part of that historical moment, becoming the first rabbi to be married legally and with federal recognition to his husband, Stephen Littlehall. And he was a devoted scholar of classical Reform Jewish music, bringing the traditional liturgies and music to Jewish life into synagogues. And he is a rather extraordinary man. My connection with him, I never met him, but is only indirectly based on his criticism of me, which anyone wants to criticize me, there's plenty to criticize. This was the deal. I guess that he knew that through the grapevine that I had been elected the rabbi of the Reform Temple, and he saw this congregation as one of the flagship of the classical Reform synagogue, which it never really was, whatever. So evidently he saw a picture, either streaming or something, of me wearing a kippah. So he called one of our members, who is no longer a member, but who was a big deal in the Society of Classical Reform Judaism, who said, "What is your rabbi wearing a kippah for?" Which, because that's not something that he thought classical Reform rabbis should do, and I think he's absolutely wrong. But but he was still an amazing man. And I think his death is a loss for our congregation. And if you just open up for a moment in your Siddur to page Roman numeral 11, in the very beginning of our prayer book. It's Rabbi Howard Berman, The Society of Classic Reform Judaism, where he talks about the fact that he was involved in 2000 in this restoration or renewal of the Siddur. And so he gives an outline to what he was trying to accomplish and what they were trying to accomplish in it. So what I want to do is, I want to share with you some of the things that he said about what he thinks Judaism is, because what he says is worth listening to. And even though I often don't agree with him, by the very nature of the kind of rabbi I am, I think he's incredibly articulate. He was an incredibly wonderful and gifted man, an incredibly generous man. It was nice, he would go to Israel every year, and he was very supportive of the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. And my daughter remembers he came to the students, he took them out to lunch, he gave them a copy of the Reform prayer book. He was really a mensch, okay? Even though he didn't like my kippah. Okay, but I'm an open soul, a forgiving soul. You know how forgiving and open I am, aren't you? Yes, of course. So I want to share with you what he thought some of the fundamental principles of classic Reform Judaism were, and see how they resonate. And I think that, I know Don Goldman, thank you, Don is our technician person tonight. My message will be recorded, and perhaps some of the people who want to think about what the New Reform Temple is about might look at this and see, is the New Reform Temple really like this? And again, this is not a discussion of this is right and this is wrong. It's a question is, there are different philosophies and approaches, and I'm not someone who believes one way is right, one way is wrong, and I don't even believe my way is right. Sometimes I think my way is wrong. I just think we should be open to the principle. So this is what Howard Berman writes in his statement, and I can send you the link to it. He says, the fundamental principle of classical reform is the eternal Jewish covenant with God is at the heart of our identity and history as Jews. And while our faith engenders and empowers many different understandings and interpretation of the divine, it is the religious quest for faith and meaning that is at the core of our Jewish identity. So it's all about religion. If you recall my Erev Rosh Hashanah sermon, I said it's all about peoplehood. He completely rejects what I said. He says, we believe that Judaism is primarily a universal religious faith rather than an ethnic, cultural, nationalist identity. As a spiritual community, we cherish the unique ties of history and destiny that link us to our fellow Jews throughout the ages and around the world today. But we understand the Jewish people as a community of faith, bound together by our shared experience, grounded in our distinctive teachings of Jewish religion. So the rich and varied ethnic and cultural traditions of the Jewish experience throughout the ages offer a meaningful dimension for our religious identity, but our faith is timeless and universal in its aspirations. He believed that Judaism is a universal faith, which I also believe, but his view was it's first a universal faith, and the rest of it is like frosting. My view would be that the people is the cake and everything else is the frosting. He would say the faith is the cake and everything else is the frosting. It all depends what kind of cake you like. They're both good cakes. Of course, my cake tastes better than the other cake, but okay, so that's number one. Number two, we uphold the historic Reform concept linking to our emphasis on the ethical and moral vision of our Hebrew prophets of the mission of Israel. This belief holds that as Jews, we are called to be witnesses to the unity of God and the unity of all humanity. So he says that Reform Judaism is supposed to be rooted in not so much Jewish law, but in the vision of the prophets of ancient Israel, who had a vision for repairing the world and a belief that that the Jewish people have a mission to all the peoples of the world. Okay? Number three, I'm editing this, but you're going to get the heart of it. This is where I want to focus. and this is so relevant for our temple and for the future discussion of what our temple should be or will be in the future. We cherish the distinctive worship traditions of historic reform, a meaningful participatory liturgy that appeals to both mind and heart. This commitment has always embraced a primarily English language worship service, enriched by timeless elements of Hebrew text and song that symbolically link us to our past and to our fellow Jews throughout the world. In other words, English is important. And yet, we would insist that what makes worship truly Jewish is not its degree of Hebrew usage, but rather the ideals and values it reflects. In other words, you read in our liturgy, it's a lot about liberal values, about prophetic values. It's not, the Hebrew text is less important than the general philosophy of the Siddur. He goes on to say, classical, now this is where it gets interesting. I want you guys to hear this. Classical reform, because you came here in rejection of this. No, I'm being serious. I'm being very serious. It says, you are the statement against this. It says, classical reform worship also embraces the role of inspiring choral and instrumental music that elevates the spirit and reflects the highest artistic standards. He liked a high church religion, a high church with choirs and organs. This was his model of what he thought classical reform should be, what Reform Judaism should be, drawing on both the great historical musical traditions that have been distinctive heritage of Reform synagogues, as well as compositions of contemporary creativity. Yet, another dimension of historical Reform worship is the importance of intellectually challenging preaching that offers the wisdom of our Jewish tradition, addressing both the pressing moral issues of the day, as well as our personal spiritual growth and deeper meaning of our human experience. That's what I aspire to do, whether I do it or not, at least my aspiration. We believe that these characteristic qualities of classical Reform Jewish worship, which for many of us are most meaningful embodied in the historical liturgy of the Union Prayer Book, continue to offer a vital creative option for many Jews today. And this includes not only members of our congregation who were raised in cherished tradition, but also countless younger people who search for meaning. He's saying, is this this liturgy that he upgraded in this new edition is not antiquated, and the idea of moving away from that tradition, he says, is problematic. I mean, that's why he didn't say this directly to me. He didn't like the direction of synagogues like this going in a more contemporary vein. He just didn't. I mean, which is fine. I don't agree with him, but the guy was incredibly smart, thoughtful, religious man. Can I just do two more things about what he's talking about? He says, we particularly affirm and celebrate the unique experience and heritage of the Jewish experience in America. Our Torah's principles of liberty, justice, and equality of all people have shaped American democracy from its earliest colonial beginnings. Inspired by the promise of the American values of freedom and opportunity, Jews have played a vital role in the founding and building of this country. Classical Reform Judaism has always nurtured this noblest heritage and has remained committed to the nurturing of a distinctive American expressions of Jewish life and culture. What he's saying is, we've developed in America this Reform Judaism. It's not like it was in Poland. He says that we shouldn't aspire to be in Poland. We should aspire to be American Jews who create our own tradition. The question is, how far do you go with that? But then he says, these obligations include prophetic dissent. I mean, he stood for all the important social causes of our time. He's a tremendous social activist, expressed in democratic process as well as full civic engagement in our society. Okay. It's really interesting. So far, so good? Now I'm going to conclude with this. One of the interesting issues in classical Reform Judaism was Zionism. And what do you do with the state of Israel? And classical reformers were against Jewish nationalism, because what did they say? That Judaism wasn't the focus of the Judaism to be based on a people. It was a universal faith. And yet, he was a lover of Israel. Listen what he says here. He says, the question of our relationship as American Jews to the state of Israel is one of the great importance and has a complex history in the development of classical reform perspective, which embraces a broad diversity of opinion. Okay? However, there are a number of perspectives that many of us would share. Okay, what does he really believe? The historic reform position has always held that the national period in the early history of our people was an important formative chapter, creating the shared sense of experience and fostering the spiritual and ethical values of that was our destiny to proclaim and share with all humanity. In other words, you can't take away from the fact that the Jewish people come together and establish a nation in the land of Israel. It's formative. You can't say that the first temple, the second temple, it's fundamental, okay? And while this dynamic view of Jewish history rejects the concept that we who live throughout the world today are in exile, which is obviously correct, we're not living in exile, we affirm that our link to the land of Israel is a deep and historic one, and that the state of Israel has a profound significance for the Jewish experience. And we share with all Jews and with many other people of goodwill the hope and prayer for a secure, prosperous Israel living in peace and justice with its neighbors. In other words, he has this vision of an Israel that all of us want, Israel that reflects prophetic values and lives in peace with its neighbors. And I'll do another paragraph, then I'll stop. I lied. I said, okay, one more thing. But this is interesting, isn't it? It goes into the fault lines of Reformed Judaism, of the New Reformed Temple. Where exactly are we? I mean, I know, and he came to speak here at least once, way before my time. I don't think he'd want to come during my time. Okay. And I wouldn't take off my kippah. We celebrate the rich diversity within today's changing Jewish community, and we're particularly committed to offering a warm, loving, and unconditional welcome to ever-increasing number of interfaith and multicultural families in our midst. We believe that classical Reform Judaism's broad universal message and embracing accessible worship have a unique role to play in reaching out to our young people in interfaith relations, empowering them to find meaningful setting for sharing their experience of Jewish tradition together. So what an incredible life, what an incredible man, what a wonderful soul, a generous person, a great force in Reform Judaism. He was the one who fought at the Hebrew Union College that the students come out actually having studied classical Reform Judaism, so they know what they're talking about. And I think we've lost one of our rebbes in our congregation in some way, because he's one of the people whose ideas and values shape who we are, either going towards those values or reflecting against those values. The world is diminished because he's passed away, and I pray that we remember him and as really one of the spiritual ancestors of our congregation. For better or for worse, or